Welcome to The Incredible Messenger, a blend of real-world stories, expert insights, and proven strategies that keep our families, communities, and cities safe and healthy. Moving beyond rhetoric and politics to practical solutions and community safety, here's your host, Jonathan McMillan.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jonathan McMillan, the host of The Incredible Messenger. And I am back with another episode. Look, I'm gonna be 100% honest with y'all. This is probably the least preparation that I've gone into with a interview or a conversation, but I'm feel very confident that I am prepared to have this conversation because you know what I'm about to say next. If you listen to the show regularly, you know what I'm about to say. I have another dope guest for y'all. Very few people have showed up for me the way that our next guest has showed up for me, even in just a personal way. I have the amazing, fantastic, phenomenal Sasha Cotton on the show. She has done so much work in Minnesota and Minneapolis, the Twin Cities. She has been a champion raising awareness around the intersection between the typical conversation around gun violence prevention and intimate partner violence, domestic violence, and expanding even the conversation about what sometimes can be viewed as controversial. And I understand why, but I think it's viewed as controversial for all the wrong reasons. Focused deterrence and group violence intervention, which sometimes accidentally and sometimes purposely gets conflated with community violence intervention. It is about the totality and the complexity of solutions around saving lives. So, with all of that, I'm so excited to welcome Sasha Cotton. So, Sasha, thank you for being here.
I'm looking forward to the conversation and talking a little bit more about the work and how we know each other and how we can save lives and prevent violence.
There's people there, at least this is my experience. There are people who are in my lives that have made such a impact, and I just feel so connected to them that I don't necessarily remember like vividly the first time that I met them. They have always been there, and I have always uh, appreciated them. For the listeners, I'll add in this piece. So I've mentioned, her home base has been uh, Minnesota in the Twin Cities area. I may have mentioned it once or twice before. I have family. I have a 18-year-old son in the Twin Cities area. Having young black men and boys who I care deeply about in the Minnesota area over the last decade or so, going back to Philando Castile, then George Floyd, and now what's currently happening in Minnesota, the political climate, and people are active, right? They're out there in the streets, and we have seen the repercussions of that. We have seen people lose their lives in that. And my son and his older brother, my bonus son, are both those guys who go out there and stand up for what they believe is right. But I'm landing on the point that I can always call Sasha to get the temperature of what's going on. And if need be, I've never had to do this, but if need be, hey, I need you to go grab, I'm not putting names out there, but like just
Yeah.
put eyes on him or something for me.
Auntie Sasha will
So
pull up for sure.
I know you're that person. If I got my phone and just look at our text thread, not only is it about, maybe not. The last or one of our text conversations was, "Hey, Sasha, my son's brother passed away. What's a funeral home that his mom should look into?" So raise that just for the audience to understand, like that's our relationship, and that's what you've been to me,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely. And any and always, you know,
You know,
I'm your Minnesota. I got you. Whether it's local or just, our friendship. But yeah,
yes,
always
right.
gonna hold you down.
And
For
so,
sure.
thank you for all that. Thank you, just thank you for being that person. Well,
I cannot remember the first time that we met. It does feel like you've always been my brother in the work. So super grateful that our journeys have allowed us to stay at intersectional places and continue the bond that we've been building. Yeah, I mean, I'm grateful for the opportunity to be here and
oh
happy
yeah,
to talk about whatever you want me to talk about. So
Well,
Fire
let's
away.
jump into it because I know the first conversations that we'll have amongst this broader conversation is your work at the National Network for Safer Communities at John Jay College has historically been known as, at least in the CVI field, as like a training ground for what's commonly known as GVI, group violence intervention and focused deterrence. And in my work, both with my, role as United, but also as I have consulted and been across the country and talked to different jurisdictions, GVI has been coming up more and more when I ask people more details about their GVI model, even here at home in both Denver and Aurora. I know that what they're telling me isn't always explained to me with fidelity to the best principles and practices of evidence around
Yeah.
group violence model and focused deterrence. So to set the record straight, would you please tell people about your work in National Network? What is the work you do?
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for the opportunity to really dig into this topic because I think it comes up in ways that people don't get a chance to really hear directly from me and others about what we do, and probably more importantly, what we don't do. The group violence intervention, focused deterrence, GVI was sort of the first brand name of focused deterrence. There are now other models, but we maintain that strategy at the National Network, was developed out of a group of people working together in Boston, often credited with this idea of the Boston Miracle. It was 66% reductions in gang and group violence in Boston back in the mid 90s. Our founder, David Kennedy, was one of the people who worked on the ground on that project. And what they found really was that bringing together, pastors and mentors and coaches from community, law enforcement, probation, parole, and social service providers to offer both like a direct message to people who are at high risk for being victims or perpetrators of violence because of their involvement with groups and gangs and gun violence, letting them know one, that they weren't operating in anonymity. What I always say to people when I'm out doing this work is your name is being spoken at tables that you don't know exist. And it's important to me as a mother, I'm a mother of Black boys, that curtain be pulled back, right? The judicial system has not typically, the criminal legal system has not typically worked that way. It has operated behind closed doors, and then you find out you're the subject of an investigation when they're there to arrest you. And so that's the first principle of GVI is really this direct communication from law enforcement that, hey, there's concerns about your behavior. You've been really proximate to shootings, homicides, and other gun activity that we think put you at high risk of two outcomes. One, being shot or killed by gun violence. And two, and part of why we're here, being the subject of an arrest and charges for your involvement with the situation. The second part of that direct messaging comes from social services and increasingly in the sites that we work in from CBI agencies, which is a message about safety, right? That you matter, you're important to people, you're a father, a daughter, a mother, a son, a community member, and your life matters. And people care about you, and your safety matters because we know that this interconnection between perpetration and victimization is deep, right? Today's victim is tomorrow's perpetrator, and vice versa. So, really, at the National Network, we've been trying to ground ourselves in safety planning and helping sites to identify not just general safety, but true safety services for these individuals who are at the highest risk of being a victim or a perpetrator of gun violence, and really planning with them what we need to do to keep them safe. And sometimes that looks like relocation. I think that's what people immediately think about is how do we get this person out of town someplace else? And sometimes that's necessary. But a lot of the times it is about gradual reductions in their involvement in some of the behaviors that they've been a part of and replacing those behaviors with new pro-social activities. So there's this law enforcement message, this CVI or social service offering saying, we have a 24-hour phone. If you find yourself in a situation that is unsafe for you because you think you're going to hurt somebody or you're going to get hurt, call us and we will do everything that we can to get you to safety if that's your need. The secondary message is, and if you need these additional social service supports to change your life, you need help with housing or mental health services or employment or education, we can also connect you to service providers long term to get you connected to those kinds of resources. And then the last message is this general community message. This is what I tend to call the pastors, the preachers, and the teachers. The people who have influence in community, who may be the most familiar party to this young person. Maybe it was a coach that they knew from their neighborhood. It could be the pastor at their grandma's church or in a neighboring community who is coming through to say, what you've been a part of hurts our community and we still love you, right? But the violence you've been a part of has to stop. And there are natural consequences to your involvement with this violence. Law enforcement is here in part because of those natural consequences. We don't want you to go to prison, but we also won't stop law enforcement from holding you accountable if you keep shooting people and it leads to the lack of safety for our entire community because you can't control your behavior. So that's like the big picture of what should be happening. And then there's ongoing relentless engagement and contact from both social services or CVI agencies, support from community, and quite frankly, the goal is trying to get them off of that law enforcement radar. That's best practice, right? That's what we want to see happen. What I often try to explain to people when we think about GVI is that we want the best law enforcement for our communities, regardless. Police exist. We need someone who holds people accountable. Quite frankly, if someone breaks into my house, I'm not calling neighborhood watch, right? I need a presence with authority to come and handle it. That being said, we want them to show up in the best fashion and format possible. And that's an ongoing thing that I think communities across America and beyond are trying to figure out and grapple with. I will certainly talk more about my experience working in Minneapolis when George Floyd was murdered and what you see and what is revealed to you, sometimes about law enforcement that you've known for a really long time, that can be jarring and disturbing. That being said, gradual reductions in their involvement in some of the behaviors that they've been a part of and replacing those behaviors with new pro-social activities. Gradual reductions in their involvement in some of the behaviors that they've been a part of and replacing those behaviors with new pro-social activities. Whether you like policing, you don't like policing, you believe in it or you don't, it exists. And they do what they do regardless. At the National Network, we provide comprehensive training that includes information around legitimacy and procedural justice and really talking through why building that relationship, not because people need to like you, but because people in the community need to believe that you're doing your job in a way that is equitable and fair, because otherwise you won't be effective. We know that by and large, law enforcement does its job by collecting information. They collect that information from somewhere, and it's largely from people.
Right.
And if people don't feel like they can trust you because you will misuse and abuse any information that they provide you, they're not going to talk to you. And that's what we see in low income and communities of color across America. When law enforcement is trusted, when law enforcement is legitimate, when they operate with procedural justice, they get better outcomes. Violence tends to go down, and there is a deeper sense of trust between the communities that they serve and the agency. That's a goal of the national networks. We don't accomplish it all the time. I'm candid and honest about the fact that we are not a police reform agency. We do a ton of training and we invest a ton of time in trying to help law enforcement agencies that we work with to not only get better as a whole, but also to identify the right officers for this work, because that's so essential. If you're going to go into someone's home or their church or a school to deliver the kind of message that I just talked about, it's essential that you can be fair, firm, and consistent while also having compassionate accountability and empathy for the people that you're talking to. And that's a big part of what the work consists of. But I think that focused deterrence is a strategy that is important. It's a great appetizer, particularly in smaller jurisdictions, to broader-based violence prevention strategies, because we do need some level of relationship between community and most impacted communities and law enforcement. And we've got to constantly be working on bridging those gaps. And we also need to be able to hold law enforcement accountable when they don't treat our communities the way that they should. And we should also lift up the officers who do the work in the ways that we think that they should and that we want them to show up. And so GVI gives us some platforms to do that. But again, the law enforcement element exists whether you're doing GVI or not. If law enforcement believes that someone is involved with gang and group violence, they are going to focus on them and they are going to try to arrest them. I think what GVI does that's different and important is provides the direct information. Because, like I said, as a mom, if my child's under investigation, I want you to come to my door and tell me. Tell him, but also tell me so I can make informed decisions about my household, my safety, etc. But also, this offer of 24-hour access to services that are particularly focused on safety are so critically important for that most high risk demographic. And so that's to me what also makes GVI different. And this intentional and relentless engagement on the most high risk folks. And our first real strategy was GVI. And we were building that kind of simultaneously with our hospital based violence intervention program, and then later developed street outreach. But one of the things that I always say is those three strategies are so critical to a violence prevention framework, right? Because if we think about those individuals that 0.5% in any city in America that are driving over 50% of your violence, they show up in a couple of places routinely. They show up in hospitals because they get shot. They show up in communities that are deeply impacted by violence because that's where they live, play, work, engage. That's where they spend their time. And then lastly, they show up in systems, right? They have more contact with law enforcement, courts, prosecutors, probation, parole than most of your average people in community. And so if we don't have a system that focuses on creating off ramps through that legal system, we leave a part of our community completely vulnerable to not having an opportunity to get the supports that they need to change their lives if they want to. Because the accountability that GVI affords is going to be there whether the services are offered or not. So for me, that's the balancing act. And I know that that's tricky and it's a work in progress, but it's the reason why I remain committed to the model.
So my mind is spinning 1,000 miles an hour because I want to do so many follow-up questions. And audience, like moment of transparency, I'm working really hard not to interject myself into some of these conversations, but you know what? That's what you signed up for because it's not an interview show. This is a conversation between me and my partner. So
That's right.
I'm gonna start here. One of the things that you said when I was doing direct services, when I was a outreach worker and I was doing violence interruption, the first thing I would always tell my participants, like when I go pick them up or I go meet them for the first time, is like, "Hi, my name is Jonathan. I work for the city of Denver, and my job is to reduce the likelihood that you're going to get shot or that you're going to shoot anybody." Right? And I would tell them like, "You're really, really, really smart. Like just talking with you, you're playing a game of chess against a whole department with budgets that go into hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars, people working around the clock to catch you doing whatever it is that you think you're too smart to get caught." I said, "So even if you're up for 12 hours a day and you are the best gangster for those 12 hours, you're still going to sleep. And there's another cop who's just clocking in on his shift, a detective, a whole team of detectives who are clocking in where you're going to bed, and they're working around the clock to follow you, to follow what you've done and your crew, right?
And
Who you're
depending on
connected with."
your sort of gravitas, multiple agencies, right? You may
Right.
be that by
Yes.
local, county, federal, state, right? The likelihood that you can outsmart them long term is the odds are not in your favor.
Yeah. Let's use those assets that you have, that this intelligence that you have, this innovation that you have. You're very personable. Like, let's get you in a space where you can use those skills to benefit you. Continuing on that track, but also connected to something you said, it's like it's also pulling in one of my most successful strategies was I wasn't just working with that participant. I'm asking them, who do you hang out with when you're not in school? Or who's your number one? Who's your partner? All
Yeah.
right, let's go pick them up. Let's go pick them up and get them bought in to your success. As a person who has studied the science of behavior change, I know oftentimes when people get involved in gangs, cliques, crews, whatever it is, a huge part of that is that they want a sense of belonging and that they want
Absolutely.
somebody who consistently in their lives we want connection.
It's going to show up for them. And they want
So much so.
purpose that I'll show up for you and you'll show up for me. And that matters, especially if you haven't had that from your biological family or a sports team or some other
Right.
place where you really felt that kind of connection.
People say they join the gang because that's my family. And it's like, that's how they view them, good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah.
So if
And
I can
sometimes they
get
are
those,
family, connected or not. They really do
yes,
replace the family dynamic. I remember working with a group of kids and they were sharing 2 pairs of pants between 7 of them, right? Like, I
yes.
mean, I think that that's an important thing for us to not underestimate the power of that connectivity and how so many of our young people, unfortunately, aren't getting it from their biological families, which is a whole nother other issue, right? The breakdown of, low income community of color, the family structure. And this is not a critique, right? But it is a reality that we're up against. Too much government dependency, too much engagement from big government has really torn away at the fabric of our extended family networks that are really the anchor of Black community. And so when people move and migrate to different places, are not living in the community that they're from. I mean, a lot of the kids that I worked with when I was doing direct service, I was baffled by the fact that they were like, well, I'm working in Minnesota, but they would say, oh, I'm from Texas. And it's like, well, where's your mom? Well, she's still in Texas. Well, how did you get here? Oh, well, she sent me up here to live with my aunt. Then you start to work with the kid and you learn like, it's not even really his aunt. It's his mom's
Mm-hmm.
friend from back in the day who she hasn't
Mm-hmm.
seen in 30 years, but mom just really couldn't afford it. So now, play auntie has put you out because you've done too many wrong things in a
Mm-hmm.
row. So now you're couch surfing and you're living in a shelter, and all of a sudden you meet somebody and you guys link up, and there's a bond there,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not even always predatory. There is an authentic bond that can and does happen that
Mm-hmm.
draws people to want to protect one another. And I think sometimes when we think about gangs and cliques, we're in this place of still thinking about like New Jack City, like it's,
Right, right.
big empires and drug dealers. It's a couple of people with a couple of guns who want to protect each other from other people who want to hurt them. It's interpersonal conflict. It is not the 90s. It is not Crips and Bloods. Yes, those things still exist to some degree. But I think it's important for listeners to understand that most of what we're talking about is a handful of people, heavily networked, who are willing to honestly kill or be killed for one another for a variety
Yep.
of reasons, who are pathologically inclined to use violence to solve their problems.
Absolutely. That was so dope how you explained that. One of my biggest critiques about how I have seen GVI and focused deterrence implemented is the outdated perception. Maybe it's not just outdated, but it's even the culturally flawed information that people have about these young people. And when I have had law enforcement who have explained their GVI model, and they're heavily leaning on this piece of, we're going to tell them that we're watching them, and if they don't get their stuff together, they're going to get locked up. And that should be the incentive for them to get, pull up your pants and go to school, act right. And I always go back to my own personal history in the lifestyle and the culture as a young Black man growing up in the 80s and 90s. The narrative about who we were, the literal label that was put upon us was we were an endangered species, that we were more likely to drop out of high school than anybody else, more likely to go to prison than college, and more likely to die before the age of 25 than any other demographic in the world. And so that created this vacuum of hope. The other piece of that is we were hearing this from the people who we liked, knew, and trusted,
Yep.
right? It was from community leaders, faith leaders, educators, sometimes our own family.
And at
And
every
although
level, because government was saying it, schools were saying it, pastors were saying it. So it came at y'all
our music
hard
was
in that
saying it,
era.
our
Yes.
films were saying it, that lack of hope, I always say that a hopeless person is a reckless person because they are looking for something to satiate despair and hopelessness. All of that, my criticism of the GVI, the way I have seen it implemented in many places, is that you're threatening people with something that just there's no fear in it. Again, going back to my experience, I remember very vividly standing in the day room of Colorado Department of Corrections prison and saying, I have been moving my whole life to be here. I
Mm.
expected to
You
be here.
anticipated this.
Yes, right? Like and that was part of the whole thing about I realized that I could create whatever life I wanted to based off the decisions I was making, but that's another story. The other piece of it is these young people are seeking connection. They look up to somebody. They value somebody's opinion. They are connected to somebody, even if traditionally we would say that's an antisocial peer, that's an antisocial influence. It's still the person who has influence
Yeah.
on the behavior of the people who we're talking about. The GVI models that I have seen implemented, they're not bringing in those people to have the conversations and help leverage those relationships. And maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse because I don't think we talked about what are some of the components of focus deterrence and GVI with the notifications and the call-ins. So can you talk a little bit about that? And then we'll circle back to who needs to be there and why.
Sure. So I think what people tend to know most about GVI is these call-ins, right? Which were heavily relied on in the beginning of the strategy. And essentially, it's a meeting. It's often held in a church or an auditorium or school, theoretically, someplace that feels neutral and safe. And individuals are usually called in because they're on probation or parole, and they are affiliated with the groups who have been identified by data to be driving violence in that particular community in or around that time frame. And the messages generally are from the mayor of that community. They are from someone from the police department, usually the chief or a deputy chief over violent crime, the district attorney, and the United States attorney. Those are our system's voices, right? Again, these things can go awry very quickly. We write scripts for people. We work very closely with our site project managers because the idea, it's like tipping the scales, right? You're very much walking a fine line. We don't want to be threatening people. And that's not the point of focus deterrence. Moderate, and I've done dozens of them. I thank the men for being there. I tell them, you are young adults or adults, and you make decisions about your life every day. And although you may have been told by your probation officer that you have to be here, you made the decision to come because you could have said, screw that, I'm not going, and you dealt with the consequences, right? So I appreciate that you've taken this hour to
So you're
show up.
showing them the efficacy that they have in their own lives, right?
You have autonomy, right? You
Yep.
make decisions about what you're going to do every single day. What I'm asking of you is to listen to the messages that are being delivered. This is not intended to be a conversation. This is a one way. We're giving you information. When we're done, dinner will be served. Everyone up here is going to stay. You can ask them questions at that time. You can set up time to talk with them. I will be around. Other people who work for the program will be around to answer questions. We ask you to give us 1 hour, right? Sit here, listen 1 hour. And then, if you're like, screw that, that's crazy. You make decisions every day, right? And you'll live with whatever consequences come from your decisions because that's life for all of us, right? So the mayor's message really should be one of, to some degree, hope, but also accountability. In theory, we want the mayor to take ownership of the fact that they are usually in charge of the police department, that they have a responsibility as local government to keep the community safe, that this strategy is designed to focus on not just holding the folks who are there accountable, but keeping them safe. Part of the reason they're here is because they are at incredibly high risks of being hurt by violence, right? So that's really the message that we want mayors to be delivering. We want the chief, the police chief, to get a little bit more granular about the violence. We want them to talk about the violence trends. We want them to say some of the things like, you're here because you're a part of a group or connected to a group, or we have reason to believe, it depends on the measure and the merit of the data, to believe that you're connected to groups that were responsible for some of these homicide shootings incidents. And that has to stop. And we are not able, this is something that I feel really strongly about. Law enforcement is not able to stop every single crime that happens in any community. I'll be honest in saying, I'm sure it's true for you. I speed sometimes. Sometimes I look at my phone when I shouldn't be when I'm driving, right? We all break minor laws every day. And we know that crime happens at exceedingly high rates on some situations and they never get solved. So what we really want law enforcement to say is we can't stop every single crime, but violent crime puts the entire community at risk. Shootings in particular, bullets don't have names on them. So when those of you are in this room go out and shoot at people, you don't just put each other at risk. You put grandmas and babies and school teachers and school kids at risk. And so we are going to focus our energy on gun violence because we might not be able to stop every petty misdemeanor or whatever, but this is something we're going to pay critical attention to because of the kind of risk it creates. And we believe you all have been a part of that behavior. And so that puts attention on you, right? And your behavior changing could take that attention off of you. So you're going to hear from other people tonight about what you can do to take that attention off of you. It's not about being on a list or in a gang database. Your behavior drives our attention. If your behavior changes, our attention will change, right? That should be the message from law enforcement. That should be the core message from them. The DA talks about their process, right? That we are also prioritizing gun and gang violence because it drives violence in the community. It's bad for everybody, yada, yada, yada. The United States Attorney's Office is usually, to me, the most valid systems voice. Because to your earlier point, a lot of people who are involved in this lifestyle anticipate that they may go to prison at some time. And when they think about prison, they're usually thinking about state prison, honestly, most of the time. They're thinking about workhouses, jails, and state prisons. That's what most people have the most, interfacing with and knowledge about. Also, the odds when you go to state, when you get prosecuted by a DA, sometimes you can strike a deal. Sometimes you end up with probation. When the feds come for you, you are likely going to prison for a long time. It's not going to be 6 months, a year, 2 years in workhouse or whatever. You're going to prison. And so what we ask of the USA's office is to really lay that out, right? I had a USA who was a former judge here, and she was under the previous Trump administration, but she was the best speaker at our call-ins because she would say, listen, I'm a mother. I have sons who are your ages. They are not in the situation that you're in, but I care about your well-being. And also, I'm good at my job. And so if I press charges, if I am indicting you, I have a 99% win rate. I don't lose, right? So if your name comes across my desk, you got a real problem on your hands because I'm going to come and say, you're looking at 50, I'll give you 10, right? And either you take that deal or you try to beat my 99% winning record. So please listen to the people who are here, take the offer of help, make the change in your life so your name doesn't come across my desk. Because if it does, I've told you, I'm coming. And so I invest in being here. I show up because I don't want that for you. But if that name pops up, it's on and cracking, right? And so I think that speaks to the procedural justice of like, these systems are in place and they're not going anywhere anytime soon. So we as a community need to know how they work. And she talked about, you're not going to go up the street. You're going to be across the country. Your parents are not going to be able to come and see you like they would if you were an hour or two away. Your girlfriend that you date that would be showing up maybe at the county jail, she ain't coming to see you if we're in Minnesota and you get sent to Texas or you get sent to Colorado, right? So just laying out all those expectations. So that's kind of the systems picture. And then there's a whole other half of the program that's community voices. So we have a voice of pain, we have a voice of redemption, and we have a voice of hope. And then an offer of service. I really think the voice of pain is usually the most critical voice. It is usually someone who has lost a loved one due to gun and gang violence. One of them that I've been to recently, it is a daughter of a mother who was killed in the crossfire of a gang shooting. So she lost her mom to gun violence. Her mom was a senior citizen. Her daughter was in the car with her grandma when she died. So her daughter held her grandmother as she died. And she pounds on the podium at one point in her speaking, and you could hear a pin drop. She's furious. You can feel her wrath in the moment. And she really points out to the kids, like, part of the reason my mom is not here could be because of some of the stuff you've done, right? So take that in, right? My daughter goes to therapy twice a week. because of the gun violence that some of y'all may be connected to. So I think that that's a chilling moment for some of the young men who might otherwise sort of slouch down their chairs, or, they're there, but they don't want to be there a lot of the time. But they sit up and listen to usually the voice of pain. Sometimes it's a mother who's lost a child. Sometimes it's a father, all of that. The voice of redemption is usually someone who's done time, someone who's been involved in the life, who really speaks to this notion of, don't do what I did. You don't have to invest a decade or more of your life being incarcerated. Learn from my mistakes, right? And then the voice of hope, again, is that pastor, preacher, and teacher kind of moment, right? Of like, you deserve better. We have, as Black men, sometimes failed you. We haven't always been there the way that we could have or should have, but we're here now to tell you we don't like what you're doing. We want you to change, but we'll walk the walk with you. There are people here who will walk the walk with you. And then we talk about the services that are available, and then we have dinner. And I really encourage people to get into the dinner, right? Like, have a good caterer come in and do a meal that accommodates the cultural needs in that community, and break bread with people, right? I mean, I've seen sites that do name cards in front of the gentlemen who have been called in, where it's like a dinner experience, right? Where you're really trying to elevate them that you matter. Yes, there's this pressure because your behavior requires it, but you do matter to people and you're not disposable, right? I think so often we treat you as if you're disposable, and you're not disposable. So it can be a motivational opportunity. I think where a lot of sites get it wrong, and it's something we're constantly coaching at the National Network, I'm really insistent now that our staff go on site and be at call-in so we can see what people are doing, give them a lot of feedback on how they can do it better. It's labor intensive, but I think it's important. It's a fine line between informing people about their circumstances and threatening them. And that's true for call-ins and customs. And police in particular, law enforcement at large, have an omnipresence all the time. And it's very difficult for them to rein in their energy, to not be accusatory, to not be feeling forceful. We do want them to be firm and direct, but it should not be, take these services or you're going to go to jail. It should be, your behavior is unacceptable, and if you don't change, there are consequences. And there are services to help you change if you need them, right? So it should never be, take the services, forget the pressure. It's really, stop your behavior or there are consequences. Do you need help to change?
So, Sasha, again, thank you for such a detailed explanation, because I think people need to hear that there really is evidence around the best practices and the best ways. There was thought and detail even in the order of operations of how speakers and who speaks. And you even said, like, there's a script, and, cliche, but if you stick to the script, you're going to get the results. You think about, like, telemarketers, they have a script. They have a script that somebody thought about because it gives you the best odds of getting the sale,
Absolutely.
influencing somebody's decisions and their behaviors to separate their money to buy whatever product it is, right? There's a script that has been evaluated, the results that it gets to get these young people, participants, to participate, to even consider behavior change. I have a question. Kind of going back to what I said earlier. Where do the call in, where does the auntie, the grandmother, the mom, the sibling, the best friend, where do they fit the call in process and then beyond?
Yeah. So generally speaking, in a couple of ways, right? So we always encourage people to bring what we call influentials with them, right? That you should bring somebody with you to this, both because you need support. It's an intimidating process. I'm always really transparent about that. People don't know what's going to happen. And quite frankly, a lot of the times they think like, oh my God, they're rounding us all up because we're going to get arrested tonight. We want people to bring influentials with them because it's grounding, but also because we want the influentials to hear both the real potential for consequences and the real offer of help that's being made available. And that's true whether we do a call-in or if we're doing customs, which are delivering a similar message, but going to someone's home or a meeting space or probation or whatever. They're prearranged meetings with people where we deliver the same kind of message that we do in a call-in, but in a more scaled back way. And customs are becoming the more routine way to do this level of engagement. We learned a lot, both post George Floyd's murder and during COVID, because we couldn't do call-ins. Like it just wasn't possible with all of the regulations. And then with the murder of George Floyd, we really had to rethink how we were utilizing and engaging with law enforcement, because there was this dip in credibility even beyond what was normal about what it just wasn't reasonable to have law enforcement, in any way finger pointing or telling people they're going to get additional pressure when we had just watched what we had seen happen to George Floyd on television and the unrest that followed. And so we really had to think about, how do we deliver that same message if we don't have a law enforcement partnership, or we have one, but it's not applicable to have them involved. And part of this shift was really away from incarceration, because it is a predictable outcome. Some people who are living that lifestyle just know, yep, I'm going to probably go to jail or prison at some point. It's just a part of the game. So we really pivoted to saying, I don't want you to die, right? You may not care about going to prison, and you might not care about going to jail. I don't want you to die. And even if you got away with it, I don't want you to live with the burden of having taken a life, right? And so this is where we get into this community moral voice, right? Where it's like, this is a moral compass moment, right? If you talk to these young men one-on-one, they know the stuff that they're doing is wrong. They might be able to legitimize the why, and I got to do what I got to do, and X, Y, and Z. But if you really get at their moral compass, they know that hurting other people is not right. And if given the opportunity to change, a lot of them will, if we can give them an honorable strategy to get out of that lifestyle, real pathways towards something different, supports not only for them, but for their networks, for their families, and real relationships that walk with them who understand their lifestyles. This doesn't work if we don't have credible messengers. A lot of the times people want to grab, Jamal, who went to the university and is from the neighborhood, but doesn't, or is from the suburbs sometimes, but doesn't know anything about the neighborhood, doesn't know anything about the life, and expect him to mentor somebody who has been toting a gun since they were 12 or 13. That's not going to work, right? So I also think it's really important when we talk about violence prevention comprehensively that, yes, we have outreach workers and others who are doing CVI, and that is different and separate from GVI and Focused Deterrence. But someone who does CVI could have just as easily ended up being a credible messenger in GVI, and vice versa, right? That we want people who have relationships in community. We want people who have lived experiences. The difference with a GVI strategy versus something else is that they also have to be a person who can, for lack of better language, stomach having a dynamic with law enforcement, which is hard. And it's not for everybody, right? It is a unique skill set to have been a person who has been in that life, who can also put their feelings about it to the side to say, I believe in the power of partnership. And that's really our tagline at the National Network, that yes, CVI works at reducing violence. And yes, law enforcement holds people accountable. And yes, community can do events and engagement and accountability. But when we fuse those things together, we can have even greater impact. And if nothing else, we can really reach those people who are deeply systems involved and need an off-ramp to change their life. And so I'm a believer. I've seen it work. I've seen it have impact. I've also seen it be done terribly. And I've been really honest about the fact that when implemented without fidelity, without support, often without technical assistance, people need to know what right is. And so often when you're not doing it with people who know what right is, it's easy to make mistakes that lead to harm. You can do real damage, not only to the strategy, but to people. We're talking about people's lives. And we've got to be really careful anytime we blend community and law enforcement and focus our attention on people.
Man, this conversation is so dope. I want to circle back to something that you just said. We as a community need to make sure that we're creating the most effective law enforcement officers as possible that come into a community and respect the community and have the respect of the community and are there for all the right reasons, not for the wrong reasons. And that we are building relationships within our communities with those who are at the highest risk of experiencing
Yeah.
encounters with law enforcement, right?
Well, and in those
Online.
communities,
In
because
those communities.
if obviously the people who are committing crimes don't want to get caught, right? Generally, they
Yeah.
hope that they don't get caught. They know that they might eventually, but they're not doing it with the intention of getting caught. And the reality is, as you and I both know, the data shows that it is a very small percentage of people who drive the overwhelming amount of violence. We're really clear about this when we're training at the national network. There are no such things as bad communities, right? Communities exist and people live there. And most of the people in any community want to do what everybody else wants to do. They want to go to work, they want to go to school, they want to raise their families, they want to be safe, they want to have food on the table. And there's a small percentage of people who are making those things harder and less possible and more dangerous because they are involved in foolishness and nonsense and not just on the block arguing and throwing blows, but actual gunfire that makes that entire community depreciate its value, makes it less safe. And we, as people who live in those communities, because I come from one of those kinds of communities, learn to navigate those spaces, right? And in spite of all of the things that we know can be negative about them, we love our communities, right? Like, I still live very close to where I grew up at. I don't have to, but I love my community. I
Absolutely.
don't want to live in the suburbs, right? And our communities are constantly changing, right? And it's not a dangerous community, but it's an urban community. Violence happens here, things happen here like they happen everywhere. But I love where I live. And so I think it's really important too that we're reminding law enforcement, especially in places that don't have residency requirements, that the people who live here are not the problem, right? There's a small number of people, and the people who live here who know who the problematic players are don't like it either, right? They want that
Right.
behavior to change. And if they trusted you and they believed that you would operate with integrity, they believed that the system would be fair, which is maybe out of your control, right? But they don't want to see people be treated unnecessarily harsh. They want the violence to stop, and they don't want to feel like they've thrown someone to the wolves in order to do it. They also don't want to draw more negative attention to their community because we know most of these communities are over policed. So calling the police has consequences both potentially from your neighbors. So I think it's so important for law enforcement who are working in community to hear from community. And young people tend to be the most transparent because they haven't been tainted yet. They tend to be willing to say the uncomfortable things. They will ask hard questions. And I think it can't be overstated how valuable it is for officers to see the humanity in our kids and to see them as children. We know our boys in particular get aged up so quickly. And so I know as a mom, when my boys were in school, it was like, nope, wear your school uniform if you're riding the bus. No, you can't get your ears pierced. No, you can't. No, you can't. Because I didn't want to do anything that would make them be perceived as older than they were. And those are real things that we grapple with. And I bring all of that to my work. I came into the system, I went to law school believing that I would be a defense attorney, decided that that was not my path. I ended up working in prison and parole early in my career because I've always had, what I always say is crooks and cops in my family, right? I have a lot of folks in law enforcement in my family. One of my uncles was the first sheriff in one of our jurisdictions. But I also have a bunch of people who have been to prison and jail and who have been involved in lifestyle. But what drew me to working inside of facilities is that I have a cousin who I was particularly close to who was really railroaded as a young person, and it derailed his entire life inside of a facility. And I needed to understand what happened in those places. And I believed as a young 20-something-year-old person, I can fix it. I can change it from the inside. And I think on a one-to-one level, I made a difference in the lives of some of the people that I worked with. So I was a probation and parole agent who understood the plight of the clients that I worked with. I think I was still fair and firm and consistent. I think I provided support and accountability and looked at the whole family. But that's impacting 20, 30, 40 families at a time. You're not able to change the system that way. And so quickly started to realize that something different was going to probably be my calling. But my experience will always be colored by that. And to your point, I think in my entire time working with, and I worked mostly with men and mostly with young men who had chronic offenses, who were either juveniles when they had committed heinous, felonious acts and were incarcerated at a very young age, or young men who had been what we call EJJ here, right? I think of the hundreds of young men that I worked with, I only had two that I actually felt some fear of. One of which was a kid who just saw his trajectory as being in prison. So he's like, my dad's in prison, my uncles are in prison. So he's at that time, he was in a juvenile prison here in Minnesota. And he was doing any and everything he could to get his adult sentence. Because he just wanted to go be with his family in the adult prison, where he felt like he would be, so I was like, well, what a better way than to knock me upside the head. And then I had one young man who had a really tortured sexual history, just probably needed to be long-term out of community for the safety of everyone. But other than that, most of the people that I worked with, some of whom were murderers and had done, you look at their rap sheet and then you sit down and you talk to them and it's like, these are people, right? And I think Collins and Customs also give law enforcement a chance to see that these are not just the bullets and mugshots that you open a file and see. These are real people. And I think that that's an important purview for those officers who are willing to see it that way. And the ones who aren't are not well suited for this particular project.
I'm going to go out on a limb and say not particularly suited for that project. And quite honestly, like, based off of what you said, and I'm making a huge assumption, but I'm going to stand on it. For law enforcement, right? If you cannot see the humanity in somebody else, like, this isn't your pathway. Work at a call center.
Agreed, because I've over time and experience become a realist to some degree, right? And so even in the sites that we work in, would we love to go in and change the culture of policing across that entire department? That would be amazing. But what we can tangibly try to focus our energy on really doing is changing the culture of the unit that delivers GVI services, right? If we can get to a point where a year into the strategy, people in the community are like, I don't trust the police, but I trust that guy because he's been in my house a bunch of times.
Yes.
That officer has said he would do X, Y, and Z, and he did X, Y, and Z. He told my son if he had to come back here, he was probably taking him to jail, and he did. I mean, we have seen a number of places. And again, for all of the highlights that I'm giving about how GVI and relationships between community and police and CVI and police and all of the things can work, there are a million stories for how it hasn't, right? It can go terribly wrong very quickly when you have the wrong formulation, the wrong supports, the wrong intentions. It's really important to be thoughtful, calculated, evidence-based, data-driven when you do this. And that's why I really strongly encourage people not to just grab a GVI manual or a GVRS manual and go about doing it. I think in the beginning of Focused Deterrence, it was really the first time that community and social service agencies had an opportunity to partner with law enforcement, and that power differential is always at play. And so they would default to law enforcement. When I first started learning about GVI, some of the things people would say to me was like, well, just do whatever you can do to make their lives easy so that they'll want to work with you. Those days are over, right? Mm-hmm. We just can't operate that way. Public safety is so much bigger than just law enforcement, and people in offices of violence prevention or doing CVI work are equal partners in keeping our communities safe. And they need to be treated with that level of respect. Every site that we go into, that's our framework, but it's not always easily accepted or achieved, right? But that's the premise with which we have to be operating here. And I think that has changed the way that GVI shows up in the communities that are doing it well. Law enforcement sees their role as narrow and focused, and largely has shifted from these focused enforcement actions where it was like, we're targeting this group and we're gonna focus on them for 30 days. What law enforcement can contribute to GVI in the most meaningful way is data and information that they know who they're focused on. If violence prevention or outreach workers and support and outreach folks don't know who law enforcement is focused on, we can't help those people de-escalate their behavior. So really getting that information of who do you all see as the most violent groups, the most violent individuals, so that we can focus on engaging with them so we can save them if they're willing to be saved. And if they're not, then, the system's going to run its course.
I have follow-up question to what you just said. At least 3 questions I want to ask you. Can we trust that law enforcement wants to save these people? Because what I have observed over the last 4 years, maybe 3.5, there was a huge investment in CVI with the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. and I sit on boards that oversee where federal funding goes. I was in the state office, and I saw law enforcement agencies co-opt CVI funding, what they're calling hug-a-thug programs. And then they were saying, oh, but we could do a GVI program and get the same results using the CVI program if we just do the woo-woo. We'll get a couple of community agencies at the call-ins, and then it's a community-based program.
To the degree that we can root out bad actors, it's really important. And let's be really, really clear. Police departments and the institution of policing has not been designed to support low-income communities, communities of color. I'm really clear, and I think when we're training, one of the things that I try to always make sure we're talking about is that these institutions have almost always engaged with these communities in a punitive way, whether it's law enforcement, education, housing, child protection. It's always comply with our rules and we'll be nice, or don't comply with our rules and there will be consequences. That's sort of been our relationship to government for as long as we can really think about it. The reality is that's not going to change. I don't know that we can ever rely on policing as an institution to want to save our kids. I don't think it was designed to do that. And I think that there will be officers, departments, leaders who want to do that, who care about that for their own personal reasons. They came to the work for those reasons. It's really important, even when we talk about diversity in policing, to not lose sight of what we're really saying, because I don't care what race or ethnic group someone is from. Once they go into law enforcement, it is very easy to take on the characteristics, behaviors, cultural values of law enforcement that will supersede even your racial and ethnic identity. It's one of the few pathways of professions where it becomes synonymous with your identity. And quite frankly, in a lot of Black and brown communities, we ostracize people when they go into that profession. And when we do that, the law enforcement community will welcome them with open arms. So instead of coming to the cookout at Auntie's house, they're going to the cookout at Officer so-and-so's house. They're going to that person's, that's who's coming to their kids' games. Like that, again, in the same way that we see gang culture occupy space with our community, law enforcement builds those kinds of ties and relationships, and it's a kind of all-in framework in a lot of their communities as well. And so we're not going to change that. What we can sometimes achieve is if we have willing parties within law enforcement who are willing to give us the information and data. And let's be honest, it's not always right. Sometimes the community has a better understanding of who's driving violence than the police. What I want to know is if my kid's name is hot in your mouth at the police department, I want to know whether he's doing something or not, because I need to be able to make decisions about how I keep my house and my child safe. And I can't do that if I don't have the information. So I think the low bar is getting police to share information with us and tell us who they're seeing on a repetitive basis and thinking about as driving violence. And we have been successful in our sites in that level of partnership. I don't think we can ever expect for them to be the ones that hold the cards on saving our kids. That's why having social services, CVI, and the community at large as partners who do that work is so critical, and that it really is a clean and clear handoff, that it's like, here are the people. I don't need to know what you do, like as law enforcement. I don't need to know what you do when I'm giving this information, because it really should be a one-way stream of communication. And the reality is, I think the law enforcement agencies that don't have malice, that aren't tainted and operating functionally, they should want violence to go down too, right? And if what we're doing in violence prevention brings homicides and shootings down, that's good for everybody. And police departments are down officers across the board. They simply don't have the capacity to do what they used to do in the 90s and 2000s. And they're not going to replace those numbers. So getting innovative and thinking about partnership and how we bring volume of shootings down, we're not going to arrest our way out of it. That never worked. But I think there's incentive from them more now than ever to look at innovation, because they don't have the bodies. And so when we pitch something that includes them, gives them a clear role, doesn't add burden, there can be real appeal if it's done well and right with the right players and the right support.
I so appreciate that answer, mainly because it's elementary the way that you explained it. And you said you weren't making a pitch earlier. I'm not making a pitch either right now, but what you just described is the ecosystem, right? When we
Yeah.
talk about redefining public safety, it's understanding that there are multiple sectors involved in each one of them, especially in this economy right now. Everyone's stressed. Their
Yeah.
capacity is stressed. Their ability to meet the need as we see it is stressed. And if we all are sitting at the table and hold accountable to our lane of the work, whether it's a swim lane or a piece of the pie or a seat at the table, whatever it is, we're accountable to do that and do that well, that we're going to improve our public safety numbers, especially if we're looking at that very limited number of individuals who are at the highest risk of being shot or shooting somebody.
Because it's not
It,
everybody. We've
it
got to
is
be honest
not
with ourselves. It's
everybody.
not everybody. It's
And
not
and
every
I say
gang member.
this,
It's not every associated person. It's very small numbers of people.
I'm saying this to the CBOs who are listening to this right now. I'm talking to the teachers, talking to the parents right now. The likelihood that your child is going to pick, or your young person, not even child. You, matter of fact, let me double down on that. The likelihood that your child is going to pick up a gun and shoot somebody is very, very
Very
slim.
low.
It's
Very low.
actually those who are between 18 and essentially 30 years old who are going to be the highest risk of being a shooter or being shot. So, like,
Absolutely.
I
The
love
numbers
the after
hold.
school programs. Love
They're
them.
important.
They're important because it prevents the person from becoming a 20-year-old who is going to
Yep.
pick up a gun. Absolutely. The shooters are going to be between 18 and 30 years old. Yeah,
And
go
it's
ahead.
critically important that we say that because we do problem analysis in every city that we work in to really look at the data, look at by age, by demographic, by neighborhood, where is the violence concentrated, who's driving the violence, and what kind of violence is driving your homicides, which brings me to another phenomenon that we see, which is yes, group and gang violence is still a big part of the ecosystem of violence that we see in most major American cities. It's not what it used to be in the 90s, but it is retaliatory violence, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not
Mm-hmm.
Crips and Bloods and GDs and Vice Lords, but it is a group of people who are willing to act on each other's behalf. They spend time together and they all, or some of them at least, are willing to use violence. It's a lot of emotional irregulation, right? That these are people
Mm-hmm.
who have grown up in environments where using violence to solve your problems is common and effective. And if you don't give people other tools, they will continue to use the ones that they have. And that tool is often learned very early in life because people have grown up in homes where domestic violence is prevalent. And
Mm.
so we are really digging deep on that issue at the national network in addition to our GVI work because violence is a learned behavior, period, right? The biggest indicator that someone will experience violence as a perpetrator or a victim is exposure, right? So if you grow up in a community that's violent, you grow up in a home that's violent, your odds have just increased, right? We're not necessarily just talking about shootings. I mean, we're talking about violence in general. But
Mhm,
this
mhm,
attitude, this perspective that conflict equates violence becomes increasingly normalized if you've grown up in a home where domestic violence was happening. And
mhm,
you will perpetrate that kind of power and control, that kind of dominance as a bully in school, in your teen dating relationships as a young person, sometimes through group and gang violence, and sometimes through adult activity because you've learned it so early. We have a strategy called intimate partner violence intervention that looks systematically at similar to GVI, right? The highest risk, those people who are perpetrating the highest lethality around domestic violence, but also messaging and engaging with people at various levels of domestic violence involvement. We've done that for a long time and it has been equally effective. I just want to name that GVI and our intimate partner violence work, when done with fidelity, can produce 40 to 60% reductions in the violence that people are experiencing without increasing significantly arrests and prosecution, right? So even though law enforcement is involved, you should not all of a sudden see people getting arrested out the wazoo, right? That's not what
mhm,
this strategy
mhm,
is designed to do. Look at a place like Philadelphia, where we've been working for the last couple of years. this is a city that has been historically very, very violent. In 2022, I think our first probable analysis, their homicide rate was 516 at the end of that year. Excuse me, 576. Last year, that number was down to 220, right? So cut by less than half. That's amazing. Props to Philadelphia. They're doing a bunch of stuff
Right.
around violence reduction. They're replicating the Ready model. GVI is a huge part of their violence prevention strategy. And they've expanded to have a juvenile specific process because while juveniles don't represent the vast majority of shootings or homicide in any major city, when our young people are violent in this way, it is particularly egregious. And we should respond with the kinds of supports and wraparound services that will pull them away from that violence and into more pro-social activities. So we've developed a GVI junior model for young people who are at particular high risk because their families are involved in the lifestyle or because they've already been stopped in a car with a gun, or there are markers that we're looking for. It's not an after-school program. And I tell people all the time, this is not a mentorship program, right? This is a gun violence prevention program. We are working on brain development. We are working on behavior change. We are doing lifestyle work with the young person and their family. But it is also proving to have really great buy-in and success in Philadelphia and Minneapolis. Pine Bluff, Arkansas is a more rural community that we're working in, and particularly with juveniles, they were on average having juvenile homicides at the same rate as Chicago per capita in a place that has less than 100,000 people. In our implementation of GVI, we have seen them go over 500 days without a juvenile homicide. So I just want to be really crystal clear that GVI is not like some quack job strategy. It works. It can also do a lot of damage if it's not done right. And so I urge people to think about what it looks like with evidence behind it, with data behind it, with support behind it. And also to really, we are invested in looking at the power of partnership and at really looking at where violence happens in the margins, right? We know that there's a 25% crossover between people who commit acts of community violence and intimate partner violence, right? So we're really investing in training our GVI sites on how to identify intimate partner violence, how to ask more questions, not to become experts, but to become knowledgeable enough to see it, identify it, intervene to the level that is practical, and then identify resources in your community to connect people to the services and supports that could be helpful, and vice versa. Working with DV agencies so that they identify when they have someone who's experiencing or engaging in community violence. And building those relationships between those agencies is so critically important. So we're doing a lot of that work. We're also really looking at the margins of CVI and law enforcement, all focused on reducing, serious violence, increasing public safety, but coming to it from very, very different places. Much like DV workers and CVI workers, these are people who do not normally talk to each other. And quite frankly, they trigger each other, right? Because DV advocates come to the work usually as victims and owning that victimization space. And CVI workers come to the work usually through perpetration, although most of the time they've also been victimized. But we really hold up a badge of honor for people who are redeeming themselves from having caused harm in community in the CVI space. So you get those two parties in the same room, there's a lot of relationship development that has to happen before you can even talk about partnership. But we're doing a pilot project in Allegheny, and the partnership is proving that it makes a difference in keeping people safe. So there's all these innovative ways to look at the margins of where violence happens and how we can do a better job of preventing it.
Shout out to Allegheny County. I love the work they're doing out there.
They're doing amazing work. We're super excited about the work that we're seeing there. And we're actually looking at some strategic partnerships with Cities United and Cure Violence in Allegheny County. So we're excited about what that might look like.
So I own this ignorance. I am not overly familiar with the models around intimate partner violence, domestic violence. However, we've had these conversations. When I was at the city of Denver, it was brought to me that a lot of the gun violence that was happening within the youth community, I say youth broadly, crossing that barrier of 18 as being the cutoff, where there's some younger and much older. Many of our young women, particularly young Latina, Hispanic, Chicana, were the victims of gun violence in these intimate partner relationships, which is oftentimes the perpetrator, the shooter, was involved in gang culture to some extent.
Mhm.
There was a cultural aspect to it around gun ownership and the machismo aspect of it, and just there's so many different factors, right? I've always been curious when we talk about interventions for domestic and intimate partner violence, is it possible, or is it even happening, where we're applying some of the same principles of CVI to the perpetrators, intimate partner and domestic violence, where they're getting matched up with a credible messenger, a mentor, and we're doing a needs assessment to find out what's driving those behaviors, and we're walking them through the stages of change to best
Change
use
behavior.
of to change behavior to get them to a more pro-social way of living where they're not choosing violence to deal with their aggression and their frustrations and their stress and conflict. That's the question.
Yeah, I mean, so that is an emerging field that, the National Network and a couple of other places are thinking about. I don't think that there is a quote unquote model that does that in its entirety, right? We are fortunate. We have gotten funding from the Ford Foundation in partnership with Cure Violence to do a research project focused on just this, right? How do we merge these things, try to figure out what lessons we can learn? One of the things that I think we've definitely drawn on out of domestic violence services and CVI is safety planning. Safety planning is a tool that comes out of the domestic violence movement. We certainly have seen people borrow that term. I'm really trying to ground us in what it means to safety plan. I'm working on documents for CVI safety planning and violence prevention safety planning in the community space because I think it's important beyond just saying it to understand most good, credible messengers do safety planning. They don't write it down and they couldn't teach anybody else how to do it. And so we've got to fix that on a separate matter. But I
Oh, the
think
fidelity, the case management. Yeah.
one thing that I think is really important to say is that the domestic violence space has largely been curated by white middle class women, right? That was the birthplace of it, right? And
Mhm.
so at its core, in many ways, that's still its target market. Women who have been involved with men who are chronic batterers, what we would call like a pathological batterer. These are men who are often not violent in other ways. They might look like the pillar of their community. They might be police officers. They might be pastors. But when they come home, they wreak havoc with their families. And the idea of shelter comes from that need to run
Mhm,
away
mhm,
from the
mhm,
home and go someplace else. What we
mhm,
see increasingly in communities of color is people don't necessarily want to go somewhere else. They don't necessarily want to go to a shelter.
mhm,
Also, we know that in many Black and brown homes, it's the woman's home that they're living in, right? So I'm not
mhm,
going to leave my
mhm,
house because
mhm,
of whatever's going on, right? So it's a different power differential in that regard. And the violence tends to, the outcome is the same, the violence tends to look different. Where a lot of mainstream domestic violence is rooted in misogyny and this idea that women have a place and need to be held into that place and need to behave in a certain way and are sort of less than men. In a lot of, I'm going to take a step back from brown communities as someone who's also Latina. The machismo can be very real and very influential in domestic violence in that community. So I'm going to talk about Black people right now. Oftentimes in Black communities, when we see domestic violence in the home, it is really, if it's male, female, a man's inability to self regulate and his proclivity to use violence to solve his problems that leads to that domestic violence. It is not inherently, I don't think women deserve safety. I think women are less than me, therefore I treat her badly.
mhm,
Those ideas can exist, but it's usually not what's driving the violence. It's
mhm,
usually, I use violence to solve all my problems. So I'm in the streets and I smack people around or I shoot people or I threaten them and they comply. And that's how I get what I want. And so when I come home, I use that same kind of aggression in my home and it's effective to a certain degree, right?
mhm,
So I
mhm,
just think it's
mhm,
important to call that out. And the reason I say that is because traditional batterer intervention models and sort of these spaces where we talk about women have value and you need to respect them and all of that, they're not going to stand up in Black communities because that's not necessarily his problem. He's like, I don't hate women. I'm just pissed off, right? Like, I'm just in a state of rage and behaving in a way that causes harm. And so our intervention for that has to look different from somebody who is a chronic batterer, fundamentally believes women should submit to men's will, and when they don't, need to be disciplined like children, right? Like, those are two separate matters. We are really trying to have that conversation. In the Black community, the number one as of late, I'll double check, but I believe it's still current. The number one killer of Black women 18 to 34 is domestic violence, right? Black women die at exceedingly high rates from domestic violence. We also know, illegal and legal gun ownership plays a role in that, the lethality indicators. We also know intervention happens. So when you think about gang culture, group clique culture, right? We see domestic violence happen that leads to homicides I was dating this guy, now I'm involved with this guy, so now these two guys have beef, or I'm dating this guy and he's clicked up and he hit me, and now I called my brother and my cousins and they're coming over to whoop on him, so now their cliques have beef, right? So all of these things metastasize from inside the home to outside the home in ways that cause harm. So we are grappling with that and working on it. And I'm really, really excited about the funding that we've gotten from Ford to be able to explore this and do this deeper dive on training CVI and DV advocates in a municipality. I think in short order, we're going to have more answers, probably more questions too. But it's a real issue that I think increasingly we're seeing violence prevention interventionists say that they're seeing and that they don't know what to do about it. And that, quite frankly, there's still a bit of a male perspective that it's not their problem, right? That like, hey, I'm here to deal with his gun violence and his gang affiliation. I'm not going to tell another man what to do in his house. And so that's a narrative we have to deal with as well in all of our communities, but certainly overwhelmingly in Black communities. There are cultural nuances in Latino communities that we have to unpack. Cure Violence does a great job on that domestically and internationally because they're working in places like Juarez and Colombia on deep dive cartel work. And that is really unpacking cultural norms and machismo. I do not have a ready-made pack of solution to offer, but it is something that researchers and national folks are thinking about and applying knowledge to.
I appreciate you even considering the question because it was basically out of my curiosity.
Yeah, and I should say, while I've spent a good chunk of my work in community violence, I spent a decade in domestic violence as well. I worked for the Minnesota Coalition on Domestic Violence and led their prevention work. I also worked for the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American community as the research coordinator. I'm very passionate about looking at this intersection because it's so real and there are not enough solutions for our communities around addressing the unique ways that domestic violence shows up and really causes harm that no one has developed meaningful solutions to.
Well, to all those points you just made, the question I asked you was a question that's probably been somewhere in my head, and I've been meaning to ask you for years now. When first time I ever saw you present, you were presenting at a CVI conference, but you were talking about the intersection between intimate partner violence, domestic violence. And I was like, I have to bring you to Colorado in order to elevate this section of the conversation. Because to your point, it's missing from the conversation. Moving beyond even the conversation around the CVI and GVI, when we talk about gun violence as broadly, actually, I'm going to say firearm related harm and violence, right? Suicide is the number one, firearm related suicide is the number one experience of firearm related deaths. It's suicide.
Yeah.
Period. Point.
Overwhelmingly.
The next piece is maybe community violence, but mixed in those, when we say community violence, depending on what data you're looking at, that may just come up as interpersonal violence, which then blends domestic intimate partner violence with community violence.
Domestic violence is grossly underreported.
But then we also have the domestic and intimate partner violence that's happening. And that's a lot because, again, the underreported, the gun culture, and the access to firearm availability, so many different things. And so, again, the purpose of this platform is to help people raise awareness that this is not just a gun rights or a gun control issue. It's about saving lives of the people who we work with, who we worship with, who we go to play with. And there's so many people who are impacted by a firearm and the behavior that causes someone to pick up a firearm to hurt themselves or others.
I mean,
That's
gun safety is such. I live in Minnesota. Gun culture is big here. Many of my family members are gun owners. I'm a licensed to carry gun owner. This is not about saying people don't have a right to their Second Amendment rights. This is about saying whatever choices you make about guns, they need to be done safely. They need to be done with a lot of training, information, resource, and protection because guns do cause a ton of harm. And the likelihood that some of these bad things would happen are greatly reduced when guns are either not present or are safely present. So if you get nothing else from this message, it's that gun safety is critically important and really thinking about if and why a gun needs to be present in your life, in your home, is the number one question you should be asking. It's a question that I always asked. If my boys were going to stay the night at someone's house, it's my right to ask you, do you have firearms in your house? And if you do, are they properly stored?
You mentioned earlier about violence being a learned behavior. And oftentimes, a domestic violence perpetrator was a victim or at least saw violence very early on. Part of what you're saying is that violence is a communicable and a preventable disease, right?
Absolutely.
Recognizing that when somebody is exposed to violence, the likelihood that they are going to experience or commit violence increases exponentially. But it's also preventable.
It's
It's on the
treatable, right?
treatable is the
Yeah.
correct word. The fact that we're having this conversation also gives me hope that we recognize there's a science to this and we can do something. Sasha, I have this last question for you. And I apologize to anybody who I'm guessing probably has been waiting for me to ask this question for a very long time because you said it very early on in the conversation. Can you explain what procedural justice is? People know restorative justice. Procedural justice is a very specific thing that I don't think a lot of people are familiar with. I don't want to butcher it because I'm not that fluent with it.
So the core idea, and I'm just going to read this, is that people are more likely to trust authority, comply with rules, and see systems as legitimate when they feel the process is fair. Even if they don't get the outcome that they want, if they feel like they've been treated fairly and that justice has prevailed, they are more likely to have faith in that system. And the people around them who have observed it are more likely to comply and have faith in that system long term. So again, it's really about saying what you'll do and doing what you'll say, right? The best example I can give is when you think about racism, right? The biggest trick that racism plays is that it constantly has you questioning, right? You go into the store and it's like, oh, is this person treating me weird because they're having a bad day or because they're just a grouch? Or is it because I'm black, right? The lack of procedural justice does the same thing, right? Am I being treated this way by law enforcement because this guy's a jerk? Is the officer racist? Is the officer having a bad day? Is he trying to show out for his boys? Or is it because of my behavior? Procedural justice policies really try to hold law enforcement to operating in a way that is best described as fair, firm, and consistent, right? That I can rely on and expect the behavior of any law enforcement officer that I engage with, that if I do X, Y will be the outcome. I can rely on that. And so if I avoid doing X, I don't have to encounter Y, right? That doesn't mean you'll never have an experience that feels negative. It means that your experience should be predictable and it should be fair and transparent, that you should understand what is happening, why it's happening, and what will happen next.
I love that. Thank you for that. I have a problem with the word justice just in general because it's so subjective. It is not an objective concept. So even when people say social justice, I'm like, what does that mean?
Justice
Um,
is very abstract. And as a survivor, I've often talked about justice is so much in the lived experience of the person, right?
yeah.
My perpetrator ultimately was incarcerated, charged, convicted, incarcerated. It did not make me feel safer. It did not make me feel like justice prevailed. I suppose I might have felt like it was injustice if nothing had happened, right? Like I
Mhm,
might have
mhm,
felt
mhm,
like,
mhm,
oh,
mhm.
this feels unjust. But barring the fact that the exact same thing with the exact same outcomes happens to that person, can we ever really render justice? And then we have to remember that our legal system, right? So I'm careful. I don't like any of the terms, but I do tend to use criminal legal system over criminal justice system
Right, right.
because the system is not designed to provide justice for the victim. It is designed to provide a process and a legal outcome that is in the best interest of the state or the community at large, right? And that is different from how we sometimes think about it or frame it. It is not designed to make me feel in civil court, you're holding people to the standard of making the victim whole.
Mhm.
But in criminal court, that is not the design. It is really about the best interest of the state and the community at large. So I think, again, transparency in how systems operate is so important because we are often taught to believe things about our system that have never been true.
Right, 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 right.
Learn how the systems work and what they're designed to do so that you can rely on them for what they're worth.
I think we shatter a whole lot of people's illusions too. A lot of terms and concepts that are being thrown around loosey goosey nowadays, which is why this was such a dope conversation.
Yeah, I'm so
So
glad that I got to do this. I'm really excited. It took a while, but we
I'm a
good.
true believer that things happen when they're supposed to and as they're supposed to. So I close every episode with two things. So usually I typically ask every guest, how do they take care of themselves in a field that is so heavy? And you already said it. You live in the same community. You live, and so for many of us, it's not like we clock out and then go to something else, and this is just a 9 to 5 job. I know you personally. I'm following you on IG. I've talked to you. You're in the community. You probably got a bunch of stuff coming up this weekend where you want to be there, not even in your official capacity, but because you're a
Right.
member of the community. I'm the same way. And so I ask this question as your friend. There's a duality of it is whoever's listening to this, I want them to hear ideas from my community, but even if you're not doing that, if you're okay with it, be transparent in that. And then I will do my best to hold you more accountable because I know I would ask the same for you. So the twofold of the question is how do you take care of yourself in this work in a way that is effective? And then the second part of this is I end every show with the show is titled The Incredible Messenger. I titled it that with intention because we know the phrase credible messenger, what that means in the work that we do. And the people who I invite in the show, I see as incredible, credible messengers for their lane and the expertise of work. And so obviously I see you and you proved it that you are very much expert in that space. And I know so many people are going to hear from you. So part one, how are you taking care of yourself in this space as a human being with a beating heart who cares deeply? It has gone through a lot personally and professionally. And number two, as a credible messenger, is there a message? What is your message that you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I think increasingly two things. So, one, I am actively working on going back to therapy because I think it's good and important and cathartic, not because I'm broken or like there's something wrong. But as you said, we experience a lot of things in life, and I think it's important to have a neutral party to sort of bounce ideas with and think through where you might not be, that bias is creeping in, right?
Mhm.
So, having somebody to help you honestly, take down your biases that you have about yourself, right? Because sometimes I think, particularly those of us in this work, we think we're indestructible and that we don't always deserve peace and joy and love and light. And so for me, our returnative therapy is really about that journey of removing some of the bias I have about what I deserve and what I want. And this, I'm 45, I turned 45 last year. So what do I want out of this next chapter of my life, professionally, personally, and all the things. The things that I do already is I give myself morning time for praise and worship. I grew up in a very religious household, have gone through my own, I would say, spiritual journey. I am a believer, adhere to a Christian faith principle, but not in the probably most traditional sense of the word, but really have always found my connection to Creator through praise and worship. So I make time, even when I don't feel like it, to use my prep time in the morning for getting ready for praise and worship, to listen to praise and worship, to surrender my heart and my spirit to a higher being, something bigger than me. I think it's always really important to be reminded that there's something bigger out there that's got hands and control over everything that's going on, because we can feel so burdened by fixing and teaching and training and, doing. And so being reminded that we're not in control. We do our part, but we're not in control, I think is surrendering to a certain degree. And so those are the things that I do the most, along with, of course, spending time with friends and family, getting out, enjoying my community. I love to travel, although I do too much of it for work these days. As far as like a lasting message, I think the things that I like to remind people of is that violence is not any one person's problem. We all have a role to play. And that it starts at its core with knowing the people around you and centering humanity. I'm a Twin Cities resident, and obviously people saw Minnesota and the Twin Cities a different way. Obviously people saw what they saw after George Floyd's murder, good and bad, right? And I think the heart of Minnesota and the Twin Cities really showed up in the Operation Metro Surge, and the prep work that George Floyd's murder created was that we have been much more intentional about knowing our neighbors, building networks, and staying connected. And so I think being connected to other people is one of the best forms of prevention of a lot of negative things, including violence, because we're much less likely to hurt people that we know and that we care about and whose humanity we can and have seen. So know your neighbors, love on people, lead with love. I always say offer grace to yourself and others, because we are usually really hard on ourselves, and no one's the villain in their own story. So even people who it feels like are the antagonists are likely operating from a place where they believe they're doing the right thing.
I started off the episode and said this was the episode that I was probably did the least amount of preparation for, but felt the most prepared. Maybe not the most prepared, but like was very confident in how this episode would go in this conversation. And I was right. Look,
That's dope. I feel really good about it. Good conversation.
I do too. Oh, man.
I'm so grateful. I think the elevation that you've used this platform for is so important to the field, to community. So thank you for giving of yourself in this way.
And if you made it to this part of the show, then you agree with Sasha and I that this was a value packed. And so I thank you for sticking in with us, and let me know what you think. Let me know your thoughts as this is published, whether it's on Spotify, YouTube, Apple. I would love to hear from you. I'm sure Sasha would love to hear from you too. If you have questions, comments, as best as possible, we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Lastly, do me a favor. If you found value in this, please share this with somebody in your network. Let them know that there is a place for them to learn more about what the work looks like, for them to be connected with the subject matter experts who are talking very freely and openly. Lastly, do me a favor, take care of yourselves and take care of others. I'm out. Peace.